Hello, all. Welcome to the live stream. Welcome back to another episode of Decred In Depth Live. I have a very special guest with me, a man who needs no introduction. I'm very excited to bring on Luke Powell to talk about the changes that are being made to politea. Without further ado, hello, Luke. Luke, thank you for your time. I'm just going to jump right into it. Everyone knows in the Decred community who you are. But where are you from, and what are some of your earliest childhood memories involving a computer?
I'm from South Carolina. Grew up there. So I'm actually not one of these people who, programmed from a young age or was exposed to computers from a young age. I originally was a civil engineer back in the day, and it wasn't until I didn't like that career. The corporate world wasn't really for me. I found it dull. And so I was looking for something else to do. And computers and programming are really, they interested me because they're so open ended, right? Like they allow you to your success is not limited by anything. It's only limited by how much you want to put into it, right? The best programmers are orders of magnitude better than the average programmers. And so that's what interested me about it because I've never been considered myself particularly intelligent. I just work harder than most people. And so that's what got me into computers.
How did you become the lead dev for politea?
I showed up and just didn't go away, essentially. So the developers are the bottleneck. There's plenty of work to be done on Decred, and we really just need people who are able to take deliverables and just get them from start to finish by themselves, who are able to work on their own, who are able to figure out problems on their own, and work very autonomously. And that kind of setup is very tailored to my style. So I showed up. I started contributing gradually over time. Those contributions grew and grew and grew. And you'll basically get as much responsibility as you're willing to take on and can prove that you can handle. So that's how I went from essentially a part-time contributor, very little Golang experience to over 3 or 4 years, just taking on bigger and bigger parts of the politea development process and now leading the politea process.
And what was it about Decred that attracted you to work for it over the hundreds of thousands of other projects?
So I started looking for a project in 2017. I wanted to make the jump. I was a software developer out in San Francisco, and I wanted to be in the cryptocurrency ecosystem full time. The thing that attracted me to Decred was really number one, the quality of the development team, right? Decred's developers are head and shoulders, above the vast majority of the developers in the ecosystem. They just have a top quality development team with a lot of experience in cryptocurrencies and then privacy and security related software. The second reason was because they don't look at your background or care about your background, right? For me, I don't have a traditional background. And like I said, most of the things I've accomplished are just because of hard work. And so that person thrives in the Decred. Sorry, there's a lag between the audio and my headphones, so it's hard to talk because I keep hearing like everything repeated in my head. But yeah, so the quality of the dev team, the fact that they don't judge you on anything except for your ability to contribute, and the fact that Decred iterates on Bitcoin in a way that makes sense to me, right? Most altcoins differentiate themselves on some technical aspects of Bitcoin, you know, scaling on chain versus off chain, Turing complete smart contract language versus a limited scripting language, things like that. Whereas Decred, the Bitcoin developers knew what they were talking about from a technical standpoint. They made very specific trade offs for good reasons. And so I saw most of the altcoins as just not viable long term, except for Decred. It iterates on this social aspect of governance, right? How the project evolves and adapts over time. And I just thought the concept of a protocol level DAO was fascinating to me, and that's what attracted me to the project.
Politea version 0.1 was released in May of 2020. What are the biggest changes being made to the version 0.2 release?
Everything on Politea up to this point has essentially been, you could consider almost an MVP, right? The backend architecture that we chose, it was not very scalable. It was pretty hacky, but it worked, right? Politea, let's like dive into what Politea attempts to accomplish first, right? Politea is this transparent, audible platform that was built where all data submitted is signed by a user's identity. So when you create a user account on Politea, you create a public-private key pair. Anytime you submit data to Politea, you sign that data with your private key, right? So that's proposals, that's comments, that could be comment upvotes or downvotes. Any data that's on Politea can be cryptographically traced back to a specific user, right? And then Politea itself provides what we call a censorship record back to the user that is cryptographic proof that Politea received the data and accepted the data. And then all of the data is episodically time-stamped onto the Decred blockchain, right? So what that means is that you can cryptographically prove that data existed at a specific point in time at block height X and has not been altered since then, right? And so when we first started out, the easiest way to get this into production was using a Git repo as the actual data store layer. So if you're a developer, you're going to know what Git is. If you're not a developer, you probably won't. It's a version control system. So it's a way to track changes to data over time. And so it allows us to submit proposals, version those proposals, see all the different versions of the proposal. And Git actually has built into it a lot of the functionality that we wanted for timestamping. When you commit data to Git, it essentially creates a very large Merkle tree where the root, the Git commit hash, is a Merkle root of all the files. To break this down a little bit more for the audience that might not know what that means, the process of timestamping is essentially taking data and making it cryptographically verifiable that it existed at a certain block height. And you do that using hash functions. So SHA-256 is an example of a hash function. And a hash function takes a variable length input and outputs a fixed length output. So you can hash a book, right? And it will output a 64 character long alphanumeric string, regardless of how big the input is, right? And so there's a couple properties that are desirable with hash functions. They're unique. So any input results in a unique output. So you're not going to get two inputs that result in the same output. And if you change a single thing about the input, like if you change a single character or period or byte, the output will be totally different uncorrelated, right? So what that means is that we can hash down proposals or other data into this little 64 character long string and then put that onto the timestamp on that onto the Decred blockchain, meaning including it in a Decred transaction. And what that does is means that you can prove that this data existed at this block height, because you can just rehash the data to show that the data results in the same exact hash that is on the blockchain at block height X, right? And so a Merkle tree is essentially just taking a bunch of hashes and putting two hashes together, hashing it down, putting two hashes together, hashing it down, until you're left with just a single hash called a Merkle root. And that is included in a Decred transaction, right? So at that point, you can retrieve what's called an inclusion proof for any piece of data that's included in that Merkle tree, right? So if a proposal is included in a specific Merkle root that's included in a Decred transaction, you can cryptographically prove, you can go from that proposal all the way to the Merkle root and then check that the Merkle root is actually on the Decred blockchain. That's what we were trying to accomplish with Git. And Git gave us a lot of this functionality out of the box, but it's not a scalable solution, and it's a very hacky solution. Like it's very difficult to work with. So Tlog it's short for a trillion log. Trillion is a Google project that they're using for something different, but it has a lot of properties that we wanted for politea. Mainly, it allows for the creation of very large Merkle trees and quick retrieval of inclusion proofs for any part of that Merkle tree, right? And so when we move from the Git backend to the Tlog backend, we separate the data from the timestamp itself. So with Git, if you want to censor public data, like let's say a proposal is made public and then somebody makes an inappropriate comment that needs to be censored, well, that comment is already in the Git history, and there's no good way to remove it from the Git history. It's public, and we can't make it not public at that point, essentially. But with Tlog, we separate the data from the timestamp, so we can delete data without impacting the timestamp, essentially.
So
does that make sense?
It does. Does that increase the possibility for censorship then? So is it possible that I could put a post on there and someone can delete it and there'll be no way for me to prove that, hey, I made this comment once upon a time?
So anytime that you submit data to politea, you're always given back either a censorship record for proposals or a receipt for plugin data like comments and stuff like that. And that's essentially a signature from the server that signs the data you submitted. So you can cryptographically prove at any point, even if the server operators delete your data, you can still prove that this was submitted to politea, it was accepted, and they censored it, right? And if you think that you were inappropriately censored, you can go and take your data and your censorship record to the community and start a discussion about it. Like, here's proof that the politea operator censored me. I think it was inappropriate. I think this should be on there. And we can have a discussion as a community about it, right?
Yeah.
So on something like Reddit or something like that, that's not possible, right? You can get silently censored. There's no proof that you got censored. You can, manipulate upvotes and downvotes to try and manipulate public opinion. Whereas on politea, all this it was made to be designed to not allow any of this type of shenanigans to happen, right? Transparency and auditability is the core principles of politea.
I'm going to ask you this question, and you've kind of already answered it, but why was this new opcode Tlog? Why was this new opcode needed? And what does it allow that wasn't able to be done before?
Sure. So you're confusing the T-spend opcode, which is the treasury hard fork vote, with the Tlog politea changes. I know they sound very similar. So this is not an opcode. An opcode is essentially, you can think of it as a very specific smart contract for whatever blockchain you're operating on, right? So T-spend is a treasury spending opcode that facilitates the decentralized treasury spending. That's part of the Decred daemon consensus, right? That's part of DCRD, and that's part of the consensus code. Politea is entirely off-chain. So we only put on-chain what absolutely needs to be on-chain, right? We don't want to allow a lot of blockchain bloat. It looks like I just lost my headphones. Are you getting feedback into the...
So we're having a little bit of audio issues, and we're going to get this resolved. Thank you guys for bearing with us. Pick up where you left off. You were just explaining to me that I, had a little bit of confusion around Tlog and T-spend, and Tlog is in relation to being off-chain. So just continue where you were.
Yeah, so basically we spend a lot of effort in making sure that we don't put anything on-chain that doesn't have to be on-chain, right? So politea, all that data is stored off-chain, and that's why we timestamp it onto the Decred blockchain, right? So there's still cryptographic proof of what data existed at what point in time, and that hasn't been altered, but you don't get a bunch of the blockchain bloat that you would if you actually stored that data on chain, right? So everything that we're talking about with politea is not related to the decentralized treasury vote or the 1.6 upgrade. That's all totally separate.
Okay, thank you for that. In your opinion, why are the changes necessary, the Tlog changes?
Yeah, so like I said before, the Git backend that we were using it was rough. It was hard to use. It was hacky. It wasn't scalable as far as load that you can handle because you're limited by a single backend instance because the Git repos are stored on disk. Whereas with a database or something like that, you can run a database and have multiple Politea backends connect to the database, and that can help with increasing the potential or the load that it can handle and things like that. So from a scalable standpoint, the Git backend just wasn't there. Whereas the T-Store backend will allow us to scale out Politea to much larger loads, but also the second part of the upgrade is this plugin architecture that we added to it, right? So when we were originally making Politea, it was all very tailored toward Decred proposals, the Decred proposal system, because that's all we had in mind at the time. Over time, we decided that we also wanted to add our contractor management system to run on Politea, right? You can now think of Politea as a version timestamp data store instead of the Decred proposal system. So that Git backend was very specific. It was coded for the proposal system, whereas the new backend is coded to be application agnostic, right? So instead of submitting instead of submitting proposals or invoices, you submit generic records. And then we have plugins to handle the application specific validation, right? So there's a Pi plugin that is for the proposal system that checks, okay, this record adheres to proposal guidelines. CMS will have a plugin that says, okay, this record adheres to an invoice. These are the required standards for submitting an invoice, and does this record meet them essentially? So it makes a generic API instead of a very specific application API. And so what that means is that we can start building out all kinds of applications on this timestamp version data store, right? So whether it's a proposal system, our contractor management system, which is how we track work done and pay out invoices from the Decred treasury, or we have plans to launch essentially a Reddit-like forum that is built on top of Politea. Right. And this upgrade is what will allow us to do this, both from a scalability standpoint in terms of load and in terms of use cases. Right. So the plugin architecture allows us to make these add generic functionality. Like if I want to add comments, the ability to add comments, that's a plugin. Right. And so everything we build for Decred will be able to be reused in other types of applications. And it's all done through a config file, meaning if you want to spin up a Politea instance that allows user signups, comments, comment upvotes and downvotes, then you can do that using just changing config params. You don't actually have to write any new code yourself, right? And then as we continue building out Politea for Decred applications, let's say Lightning Network matures and we add in Lightning payments or things like that, or we have the Decred paywall for Politea and proposal credits where you actually have to pay Decred to register a Politea account, right? All that can be abstracted into these plugins that then can be applied to anything, right? So, an easy example is I'm a developer. A lot of developers have blogs just to talk about the work they're doing. Well, in the future, I'll be able to use Politea to spin up a personal blog that allows user comments, blog posts, and then tipping via Lightning Network, right? And all of that can be repurposed from what we do with Decred, which is cool. So if you kind of think down the line a little bit, Politea will be a general purpose version timestamp data store, but also all the governance specific tools that we build will be able to be repurposed for maybe local government, corporate governance, things like that, governance of DAOs. And that's really the goal with Politea.
Okay, so if I'm understanding, this new plugin architecture is going to essentially make it easier for people to spin up these things called instances, and the Politea instances. I guess here's a question I have. So if let's say you set up your blog, and as I already have an account on Politea, if I want to go interact with your new Politea-based blog instance, am I going to be able to use my same login, and my same private key to interact with that blog, or will I have to set up a new private key? Does that make sense?
Yes. So it will be a totally separate site and server. So when I say a politea instance, what I'm talking about is a politea server, right? So if I were to spin up my own politea blog, I'd be running my own server, and my user, all the users on my server are going to be totally different than other people's, right? So it's just like logging into a specific website, but politea provides a template for the operators of the website to spin up websites very easily with a lot of this cool crypto native functionality.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So they could have the native tipping and the
Yeah.
even just a transfer of value. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So you kind of already outlined a couple of different use cases, but how would you like to see the new changes utilized?
Well, the point I want to get it to is where Politea is really on the forefront of a crypto native web application, right? It embodies the values that Decred as a project have: security, privacy, and all of these crypto native integrations as the Lightning Network matures or as other cryptocurrency related technology matures. And I want Politea to really be kind of like the forefront that people look to for these cool new types of crypto native features.
You've kind of partially answered my next question as well, but even as we look 5, 10 years down the line, what direction do you imagine Politeia goes from here?
That's basically it. Everything, the vast majority of things that we build specifically for Decred governance will be able to be reused, especially for the governance of other DAOs, right? Decred is just a very big DAO. But everything we build for the Decred DAO will be applicable to anybody else that wants to run their own DAO, essentially, right? So we'll be able to provide a software suite of tools for running a DAO.
Yes, I'm glad that this is where we are because this is a great segue into my next question. You have put out a tweet storm and a number of prolific tweets about DAOs and your views on the world. I really want to be able to dig into the idea of DAOs and start with what is a DAO?
Yeah, so there's a lot of confusion around this in the crypto ecosystem. Excuse me. Um, there is a People use it generally, I think, to mean anything that uses cryptographically verifiable voting, right? So if you tokenize the equity of an LLC and you use that for the governance of the LLC, people call that a DAO. But that's not a DAO in my mind, right? That's still an LLC. It's got this tokenized equity layer on top of it, that can be used to add value, make things more efficient, transparent, to corporate governance, but it's not a DAO. In my mind, a DAO evolved to solve a very specific problem, right? And that problem is, how can we allow people from all over the world in all these different jurisdictions to collaborate together, run a business essentially, and where the identities of the people might not even be known, right? You can have these pseudonymous dev teams all around that are spread out all over the world, and how would you set up a corporate structure for that? It would be a nightmare, right? And so a DAO is a digital corporation, right, that allows people to collaborate on a global scale. You don't have to have your identity tied to your position in the DAO, right? You can do it pseudonymously, and this is all supported by cryptocurrencies, right? It's made possible because you can now transact with people without having to use bank accounts. You can use cryptocurrencies, right? So you don't have to have an identity tied to somebody that you're working with and collaborating with or running a business with, all over the world. So DAOs, they're limited to cyberspace, right? If you try and own an asset in the real world, you're now tied to that jurisdiction, right? And you're tied to the regulations of that jurisdiction. And so it's not compatible with the concept of a DAO, right? DAOs can own digital bearer assets, but that's about it.
Yeah, I really like the distinction you make there between sort of meat space and digital space. It really helps to create a framework for what actually separates DAOs from these traditional structures. But what exactly with these traditional structures Where do they fall short in terms of being able to capture the characterizations of a DAO?
So it's really about enabling collaboration of people all over the world, right? Without having to get all intertwined in the regulatory mess that would typically cause in like a traditional corporate structure, right? So DAOs are really these great equalizers because they allow people to collaborate and pursue opportunities regardless of their physical location, right? Somebody that is in a part of the world that might not have the most opportunities as somebody else in like the US or Europe, right? They're now not constrained with a DAO because they can collaborate with anybody and you can run a business with anybody. But it has to be a entirely digital product, excuse me. Um, like I said, once you start getting into physical projects in meat space, then you run into all the regulations and you have to go the traditional corporate route. There's very well defined rules and regulations and laws. And in the US, you know, the court system for businesses is quite good. Like you don't really want to replace that. DAOs just fill this new need that the old system wasn't able to address just because of it was built in a time when the internet didn't exist. This wasn't even possible.
So would you say it's fair to say that true DAOs are outside of the jurisdictional power of any government or sovereign?
The DAO itself, yes. The individuals that make up the DAO, like you still have to adhere to all your local laws, right? Like as a Decred contractor, I still report all my income, pay taxes in accordance with my local laws, despite getting paid in cryptocurrency and Decred not actually being a corporate entity anywhere. So the DAO itself, yes, but the individuals that make up the DAO, you're still subject to your beat space regulations of wherever you live.
So the Decred DAO is fortunate in that the treasury is denominated in its own asset. You talked about DAOs owning meat space assets and some of the problems that brings about. What are your thoughts on DAOs owning digital or synthetic representations of real world assets?
It really only works with digital bearer assets, right? So a bearer asset is an asset which the owner and the person who the value accrues to is the person who physically owns the asset, right? Like used to have stocks and bond certificates that were bearer assets. If you had physical control of the certificate, you own that stock, right? And so for digital bearer assets, that's why DAOs can own those because they're bearer assets. But even synthetic assets tied to anything in the real world, you still run into the issue of the regulations of wherever that physical asset resides and having to comply with those. And if you're going to comply with those, you're most likely going to have to set up a traditional, business entity that adheres to those regulations.
What do you make of comparisons between corporations in the first industrial revolutions and DAOs in the present fourth and or third industrial revolution?
So I think it goes back to kind of what I was saying about how DAOs they level the playing field for everybody, right? The corporation during the Industrial Revolution incentivized collaboration of individuals to produce value in the world. But those individuals were constrained by location, right? Whereas DAOs incentivize people to collaborate and produce value in the world where you're not constrained by physical location. I think that's the key distinction.
A lot of the questions that we're going to be getting into here towards the end are questions that came from the community via Twitter. What does the future of DAOs look like, and how does Decred capture a lion's share of that momentum? How does it scale out?
So the future DAOs basically looks like what the Decred DAO looks like, but not with its own blockchain, essentially. So all of the tools that we're building for the Decred DAO would be applicable to another type, a normal DAO, not a protocol level DAO, but you'd be, instead of voting with tickets, you'd be voting with some type of token or ownership of the DAO, something that represents ownership in the DAO. Now, the exact mechanics of how that would work and tie into a blockchain like Decred is not really something I can speak on. But from just how a DAO would work, you can just think of a Decred DAO and apply it to any other type of digital product that is being produced by this global team.
Earlier in the interview, you talked about politea being used as kind of like a fundamental utility for DAOs. What kind of other DAOs do you imagine being able to come about in the future, or that might be necessary?
It's difficult to predict the future because you don't know how technology is going to unfold, essentially, right? But if you imagine a world, like I'm sure a lot of people have read Ready Player One, where these VR worlds exist, right? And imagine people are going to work entirely in VR, right? Well, what kind of structure are they going to use to help collaborate and run like VR based businesses, right? You may be working with people all over the world, or maybe like a modern day example might be it's hard to think of besides cryptocurrencies right now, but that's
Maybe
mostly just a function of being hard to predict how technology will evolve and the use cases that will evolve. Like
insurance is one that gets thrown around a lot. What do you think about that?
What's that?
I feel like I've heard people talk about like DAOs that are centered on insurance. I feel like that's one that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, I don't really know. That would be very context specific. You'd have to dive into the mechanics. And again, it'd have to be insurance on what? A digital bearer asset? Maybe. But any type of like real world asset, I don't see that playing out.
For sure. So how do you see Decred interacting with other DAOs? That question comes from Amar. Thank you.
Kind of the same thing of what I've been talking about. Like, could two DAOs trade digital bearer assets? Sure. Like maybe cross-chain atomic swaps or some other type of technology. Will you have DAOs competing for to build these digital products? Probably. I'm not sure. So like trying to talk about DAOs now is very much like trying to talk about like social media in like 1999 or something like that. Like you can kind of see the fuzzy outline, but you kind of need the industry to mature and grow a little bit before you can start filling in the details.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. So this next question might be difficult to ask just given what you've said, but how does the Decred DAO differ from the DAOs you've observed so far?
I mean, the Decred DAO is really the only DAO that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Like the Argon, like Ethereum DAOs, they take a very broad definition of a DAO, where basically anything with cryptographically verifiable voting is a DAO. I just don't agree with that interpretation. I think it's using the DAO word as mostly a way to market and hype something. So yeah, there just aren't a lot of DAOs that exist in the world today.
Yeah, I think that's a very truthful and accurate answer. Thinking ahead into the future, what could be some interesting use cases for DCR?
Okay, a lot of the stuff in Ethereum, like at its core, I don't disagree with the ideas. Like rebuilding the financial system, I don't disagree with that. What I disagree with is the Ethereum implementation, storing data on chain, having these smart contract platforms, having a Turing complete scripting language. You're doing it in a way that is not scalable and not sustainable, and you're using words like decentralization and censorship resistant to a point where you're making them meaningless. Whereas in something like Bitcoin and Decred, like those words have meanings, and we spend a tremendous amount of time and effort, making sure that the trade-offs we make keep the chain decentralized and censorship resistant, right? Like I wish you could just throw all that data on chain. You know how much easier life would be if you could just put all that data on chain and do what Ethereum is doing? Like the amount of pain and headaches that the Decred developers go through to make sure that, decentralization and censorship resistance and privacy is top priority. It's just, It's very, very difficult, but it's not the reality that you can just, make these trade-offs that other smart contract platforms are making and remain decentralized over time. So how do I see Decred evolving over time? I think with enough time, Decred is going to basically eat all these other use cases, right? Like there's a way to build DeFi. I don't exactly know the specifics quite yet, but as time goes on and we kind of like Decred, okay, we take care of ourselves, we build a DEX for ourselves, like I'm sure the project will start looking more outward and incorporating these different types of use cases, actually rebuilding the financial system in a way that's sustainable, scalable, and can remain decentralized, right? The DEX is actually a really good example of this. So if you look at DEXs on Ethereum, like Uniswap or SushiSwap, they're all on chain. While this allows you to get the DEX up and running really quickly, it's not sustainable long term. Whereas Decred, we launched a DEX that actually uses a model that's scalable and sustainable long term, right? It's not on chain, it's off chain. We are creating DEXs in a similar manner that like an email server would be created. Like anybody can run their own email server, right? And it's a much more decentralized model. It's a harder model, and it's probably going to take longer to bootstrap and get liquidity, but it's something that we can run with long term.
How do you see this question comes from Checkmate. How do you see the landscape of privacy versus regulation playing out, and how has Decred positioned itself for likely outcomes?
So this is one of those things where, again, like I really wish it wasn't the case, but my default base case is that countries are going to keep cracking down on cryptocurrencies, and it's only going to keep getting worse and worse. They're going to try and crack down on privacy. They're going to try and make Bitcoin basically a KYC cryptocurrency so that they can control it in the same way that they control gold, right? So Bitcoin not having privacy is one of the biggest, blind spots it has right now, because there exists a future where governments around the world make Bitcoin a KYC cryptocurrency where if you want to transact with it with any centralized exchanges or payment processors or anything like that, then that Bitcoin has to come from another KYC centralized exchange or KYC wallet or something like that, right? And once you do that, once you kind of make non-KYC Bitcoins toxic, well, then you can do something like they did with gold back in the 30s, where with the stroke of a regulatory pen, you ban the asset, you force citizens to turn it in and at a certain price, and you can control the asset it's a lot easier to control the asset. So again, I hope that this is not the future that we go into, but I think it has to be the base case if you're thinking adversarially, right? And so Decred has actually done almost more than any other cryptocurrency in this front into kind of like protect against that future, right? One, our optional privacy is at something like 44% of circulating supply right now. We mix 5 million Bitcoin a month. Like Bitcoin mixes 50,000 Bitcoin a month. It's on a whole different. So now if you own Decred, there's basically an implicit assumption that there's not going to be a difference between mixed Decred and unmixed Decred, because the mixing is so popular among the circulating supply, right? Yeah. So if you accept Decred, you're just like if you accept Monero, you're accepting the privacy features. You can't differentiate between the two like you can in Bitcoin, where the mixing only accounts for 0.5% of the circulating supply. So that's a really big effort on Decred's part, but also the DEX is a huge part of this. Building up a liquidity source outside of centralized exchanges, right? Nation states that rely on printing fiat money to basically keep the system going, they cannot allow an asset to exist that lets their citizens opt out of that inflation, right? That's why they outlawed gold. That's why they're going to crack down on cryptocurrencies, right? And the further along we get on this road of debasement and getting closer and closer to like something like a hyperinflationary environment, the more and more and more they're going to crack down, right? The governments will be backed against the wall and they're going to lash out. And they're going to lash out at cryptocurrencies. They're going to use the same exact playbook that they used in the 80s during the encryption wars. They're going to try and demonize cryptocurrencies, say they're used by terrorists, say they're used by child pornographers. And it's going to be the same thing all over, right? But the DEX allows us to build up this liquidity source outside of centralized exchanges. The fiat on-ramps and off-ramps, those are the points of control that nation states can use to crack down on cryptocurrencies. So if we're not subject to the whims of the centralized exchanges, then we as a project control our own destiny, essentially, right? And I just want to make clear, like, we're not doing anything illegal. Privacy is not illegal. Even if the government wants to try and, demonize privacy, that notion should be pushed back against very hard, in a very hard manner, right? Like, privacy is not illegal. Transacting in a peer-to-peer fashion is not illegal. And any attempts by the government to make these things illegal should meet a ton of resistance from the community. And that's really something that, that's one of the reasons why I'm working on Decred, and I feel so strongly about it, is building these technologies that protect individual liberties and rights. I think the next decade is going to be a very turbulent time, and these technologies are going to be very important.
I couldn't agree more with everything you've just said. This question comes from BTC Uncle, or DCR Uncle. He changes his handle. But shout out. Are the current VSB auto vote rules, for example, mining empty blocks, set in stone? Are other potential reasons in the future to downvote a block?
Yeah, so Decred kind of has this interesting distinction, right? We have consensus rules, right? Those are rules that are part of DCRD. For a block to be considered valid, it must meet consensus rules. Changing the consensus rules requires a hard fork vote. But because the stakeholders are in charge of which blocks get added, which proof of work blocks get added to the blockchain, there's also these more informal rules that the stakeholders can exert on the miners if they want to. And this is not part of the consensus rules. This is not part of DCRD. This is part of DCR wallet. This is the stakeholders deciding that the miners are misbehaving or something like that, and basically withholding the reward if they do something that is considered malicious. So an example of this is the miners were dragging their feet on the upgrade for the decentralized treasury vote, right? And so it's been talked about for a while that if they drag their feet, then we can enforce it at the stakeholder level, where there will be changes made to DCR wallet where the stakeholders will not validate miners' blocks if they refuse to upgrade. And those changes were actually implemented, and just the threat of implementing those changes got the miners to upgrade and got them in line. But there is like that kind of interesting distinction in Decred between the actual consensus rules and these less informal stakeholder kind of requirements that they can impose.
That makes a lot of sense. What stops working / how do we quickly recover if company 0 gets raided by the feds and domain name seized?
So, like, the domain name, it's not a big deal in my opinion, right? Like, that's if somebody takes down the decred.org domain, like, it would be unfortunate, but it's not going to stop anything, right? Like, the Decred DAO is independent of any type of real world assets. This is also why DAOs cannot own real world assets, and why you don't want them to, because they can be you can have local jurisdictions exert like regulations on those assets that might not even be applicable to your part in the world. Like, imagine an authoritarian regime going in and seizing a bunch of real world assets from a DAO, right? And you can't really do anything about that. But as far as Decred, like, would it hurt it? It would be a pain, but it wouldn't stop anything. There are more non-Company 0 developers at this point than Company 0 developers. Company 0 still provides a lot of the core development work, of course, and kind of like roadmap planning. But again, are they going to outlaw coding? Like, Company 0 is not doing anything illegal. Coding actually in the US has been defined as free speech, right? So if you try and arrest somebody for coding or something like that, it's going to be a First Amendment issue. It's going to be a very big deal in the US. Other parts of the world, maybe not. They might be able to get away with more authoritarian actions. But regardless, like that's the point of a DAO. It's this group of pseudonymous individuals all over the world. If the individuals in one country get, held up in regulation or something like that, then the rest of the world will pick up the slack and the DAO will live on.
Thank you for that answer. These last couple of questions, they come from having shifted through your Twitter. So some of them are not necessarily directly related to Decred, but still interesting questions nonetheless. Why will smart contract chains inevitably devolve into permissioned chains, in your opinion?
So it's really about storing the data on chain, right? They put an immense amount of data on chain, right? And the entire concept of the peer-to-peer network is that people can run nodes on consumer hardware in their homes, which allows a very resilient network of nodes crop up around the world, right? As blockchains become bloated and store terabytes and terabytes of data, right, it becomes, you can no longer run them on consumer hardware. It moves to, you have to be running them in data centers, right? And then if you're running them in data centers, well, those are central points of control that if you're doing something like building DeFi outside of the regulated financial system and all of your servers are run in a AWS warehouse, the feds are just going to, or whatever regulatory entity is going to come in and clamp down on the servers that are run in that warehouse, in that server farm, right? So the whole strength of a peer-to-peer decentralized network comes from the ability to run a node on consumer hardware, right? And the more data you store on chain, the more expensive it is from a hardware perspective, from a storage perspective, from a bandwidth perspective, just keeping the network up to date, and the more professionalized the nodes have to become, right? So this is why I say that all smart contract platforms trend towards centralization, because they're putting all this data on chain, right? But you also have to think, okay, cryptocurrencies came about and there's this decentralization hype, the censorship resistant hype. Not everything needs to be censorship resistant. Like you don't want a lot of stuff to be censorship resistant, right? You don't want a lot of things to be bearer assets, right? If, let's say, hypothetically, the SEC were to run a proof of stake network with 10 nodes, these can be private businesses, but that the SEC has approved and the CFTC has approved, right? And that allows you to start tokenizing equity. It brings transparency to a lot of gray areas in the financial systems. It allows regulators to program regulation into the actual smart contracts themselves. Like, that's fine. That does not need to be decentralized and censorship resistant, right? And so I think that's the path that a lot of smart contracts are heading, is that they trend towards centralization. They're doing things that goes against regulations, and the end result is going to be that the smart contract platforms are essentially commoditized. The companies built on top are going to be where the value accrues, right? There could be a very valuable financial service company, in this DeFi smart contract future, but it's not going to be Ethereum that accrues the value. It's going to be the company built on top that accrues the value, that can also then take their financial services and smart contracts and run it on whatever smart contract platform they want, whatever smart contract platform provides, the highest throughput or things like that. And this is actually seeing with the Ethereum Binance chain war right now, right? Like, Binance basically said, yeah, these smart contract platforms are centralized anyway, so we're just going to run a super centralized one, but that doesn't have the fee issues, doesn't have the throughput issues as Ethereum's, like, air quotes, decentralized smart contract platform, right? So I think this is just how you see it play out over time. But I think a big point people are missing is that also, one of Ethereum's big scaling solutions is rollups. Everybody's talking about rollups. Rollups are a new big thing, right? Well, rollups are a layer 2 technology. you don't need to use a bloated smart contract layer 1 to have smart contracts on layer 2, right? Like if you're pushing smart contracts to layer 2 anyway, why do you need these bloated layer 1s, right? They might, in the short term, they're going to have an advantage because there's already all this tooling built up and they have network effects. But long term, what I think you're going to see is that the layer 1s that offer the highest assurances, Bitcoin, Decred, are going to have these layer 2s. And that's where a lot of people will want to anchor their layer 2s into, like the layer 1 that has the highest assurances, essentially. And that's also kind of like how I talked about, I see Decred eventually eating all use cases on a long enough time horizon. That's a big reason for that as well.
I really, really like that explanation and the way you've thought through that. I just want to check, do you have another 30 minutes? Because we have a lot of audience questions. Do you need to run, or do you have 5 more minutes?
I don't need to run. Can we just take like a quick break though?
Absolutely.
I need to tweak my setup a little bit. I got some stuff that's about to die.
No, definitely. You take a quick break,
okay,
and we'll get back to it. Thank you for continuing this, because I mean, there's just so many. It's not often we get a brain like yours, and I just want to take the full advantage of it. And there's a lot of good questions here.
Before we start, let me just put this out there that basically, like, bear markets are building. We built a lot during the bear market, but now it's time to get the word out. So if anybody has podcasts that you think would be good for somebody from Decred to go on, basically for the rest of the year, I'm willing to do whatever we need to do to really like get the word out about Decred, and just build the community. So community members out there, if you guys know of any good opportunities that would be good to have somebody like me on, let me know. I'm up for it.
I couldn't agree more. This is the cycle, and we have to get the word out and start and building that hype and use that momentum. So I will absolutely be doing my part to just continue to try to promote any Decred devs and any conversations about Decred. You hypothesized that smart contract platforms would, in the medium term, dominate because they map well to the current financial structure and entrenched VC interests. But you believe eventually the money use case for these smart contract blockchains will eventually flow to permissionless, censorship-resistant chains, as we discussed. Where are we on this journey? Like, where are we in terms chronologically?
So I think, okay, so what I said about them mapping to the existing financial system, that's what you see with like Tether and the stable coins and things like that, right? And we're in the part of the cycle where people are starting to realize that smart contract platforms devolve to these centralized platforms, which is why we see like Binance starting to attack Ethereum with their centralized smart contract platform, right? And that trend is only going to continue. And so like the exact timeline of how it plays out, I don't know. Could be a couple of years, could be a decade, who knows? It's very difficult to predict like technological progress like that. But everything that I said in that original thread, I still agree with and stand by.
Another community question in reference to one of your tweets. I'll read the tweet. You said, a theory to keep an eye on. Projects with informal governance will have dogmatic, abrasive communities because new ideas represent a threat to group cohesion. If there is no mechanism to resolve project disputes and evolve over time, the status quo must be defended at all costs. The question is, can you expand on this tweet in relation to Bitcoin and Decred?
Yeah, sure. So the block size debate was a really good example of this, right? The block size debate in the Bitcoin ecosystem was this debate at the surface of, should we scale on-chain or off-chain? Should we increase the block size or scale via layer 2s like Lightning Network? But underneath, the real issue that was being debated was who gets to decide what changes are made to Bitcoin, right? And it was this 3-year-long ordeal. And the end result was that the Bitcoin community said, okay, we're just not going to hard fork. We're only going to soft fork moving forward. Because if there exists an entity that determines the validity of a hard fork or group of people, then that's a centralized point of failure that can be captured by nation states or corporations and used to cause Bitcoin harm, right? So this was the whole reason that Decred was built, was how does a project make decisions in a decentralized manner, and how does it pay for those decisions, right? And so the block size debate came very close to ripping the Bitcoin ecosystem apart. And I think the Bitcoin community kind of developed this immune response moving forward to being intolerant to new ideas, right? Because they saw, well, if this idea about big blocks, which really wasn't a good idea from an engineering standpoint, if it can gain as much traction as it did, well, then we cannot allow new ideas to come in and cause this divisiveness to, fracture the community, right? And so I think this is a big reason why you have the toxic maximalists. They have to be very resistant to new ideas because of the potential harm new ideas can cause to the project. Whereas with Decred, right, because we have the ability to make decisions in a decentralized manner, we have the ability to adapt and evolve over time. My theory is that our community is going to be much more open to new ideas because we just want to get to the truth. We want to find the best ideas so that we can implement them, right? New ideas are not a threat to the status quo for us. And I think that that's the longer you extend your time horizon, the more likely is for Decred to gain on Bitcoin and eventually overtake Bitcoin.
Thank you for that. These questions come from the live chat. Some of them may be a little confusing, but hope just do your best to interpret. This one comes from IC or ISI. It's DEX is a great example of contributing to the whole crypto ecosystem. How do you see Decred keeping its valuable ethos and moving to profit only like corps in the future?
Like building technology for corporations? Or what specifically?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I think the question, the way I interpret it, is how do you see Decred keeping its ethos in becoming a for-profit corporation? I think there may be a little bit of confusion from this audience question, but that's the way I interpreted it.
Well, let's dive into this because this actually allows us to expand on an important point. Decred doesn't have to be profit motivated because we have the network treasury. We can use the network treasury to build anything that helps the Decred ecosystem, helps bring people into the Decred ecosystems, add value to Decred, right? So, I had a comment the other day that somebody said, the wallet is just amazing, like no other. It's very different than your standard wallet in the ecosystem, and the reason is because we can fund development with the treasure. There doesn't have to be a business that has a profit motive building this technology, and a lot of times that profit motive that has to be fulfilled degrades user experience. Just look at the web and ads as an example, right? What would the web look like if you didn't need the ad-based business model to run the whole thing? And so the technology that Decred builds, I think, will be just better. It'll have a better user experience. It will be more. Sorry, I lost my thread of thought there. But yeah, the lack of a need of profit motive is a huge incentives.
Yeah, that answer does actually answer his question because he retyped the question and with a little bit of clarification. And what he was asking was, how do you see Decred building on its freedom ethos and not spending the treasury for profit only in the future? But you answered that question just by talking about the treasury. So moving on to the next question, comes from Brian Lee. Is Luke saying politea is going to be used to bootstrap new DAOs with other cryptocurrencies? Bitcoin?
No. Okay, you can think of politea as a software suite for DAOs. So, I guess technically if there is a DAO on Bitcoin that existed, yeah, they could use politea for sure. But the exact mechanism that allows a DAO to basically have stakeholder voting, that is unclear this time.
Thank you for that clarification. This question comes from you actually answered this question earlier. So, Decred Dave, your first question I'm not going to ask because he did answer that earlier. But your second question, I'll go ahead and ask his first question because his second comment was not a question. He said, you mentioned that the new Tlog work significantly improves scalability. Can we expect immediate perfect enhancements upon release, or does it just pave the way for improvements that will come over time?
It should be a good bit more performant than the existing backend. The existing backend really isn't that slow though, so you're not going to see huge noticeable differences. The biggest thing that you'll notice, the biggest difference that you'll notice, is that you can now download the timestamps, the inclusion proof for the timestamps of any piece of data on politea. Like, for example, if you make a comment on there, you could then go in and download the cryptographic proof that proves inclusion in a Decred timestamp in a specific block, right? So that wasn't possible with Git. That's one of the big things that using Tlog allows us to do, is retrieve inclusion proofs for any single piece of data.
Yeah, so it actually was a good question, Decred Dave, and not something that had been answered earlier. So thank you for that question, and thank you for correcting me. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'm gonna ask one more question, unless someone drops a question in the chat before we close out here. Another one, a tweet, and I thought this was just a really sort of one of those meta tweets, but I really liked it because I just like thinking about how these things could potentially play out. You said society, this was part of a thread, this was the end of the thread, but you said society will be forced to reorganize. The bloated bureaucracies of the past that were funded by unlimited money printing will be no longer. Sovereignty will consolidate on a more local level. City-states will emerge and compete with the world's talent. The DAOs will live on. How do you see all this playing out? It's a big question.
So this
So
is really kind of taken from there's a book called The Sovereign Individual that lays out this thesis that the nation states, the power of the nation states that we have, the huge bureaucracies, right? Like just in the US, the enormity of the federal government, these have all peaked, and from here on out, power will consolidate on a more local level. The reason being that, like, the US government, for example, funds itself via fiat. Like, if they did not have the ability to print money, then they would not be able to run the massive deficits that they run, right? And so as you see the fiat system collapse, how long that takes, I don't know. It could be quite a while. But as you see that collapse, these federal bureaucracies are not going to be able to fund themselves in the same way. And so what you'll see is more local representation. Like in the US, you'll see more states' rights, states taking over control and governing themselves and having much more autonomy as the federal government loses its funding because it's losing its ability to print its money and fund its deficits, right? And so power will consolidate on a more local level. You'll see city-states emerge, meaning that large cities will be competing on a global scale for talent, because the new age of jobs, like you don't have to be in a physical location for a lot of them, right? You can move anywhere. And so you'll have, what people refer to as sovereign individuals, right? That vote with their feet. If they don't like the rules and regulations of where they're at physically located, the barriers to leaving are now much, much lower, right? Because they can work from anywhere. And so competition drives better results, right? And so you'll have competition among these local entities competing for the world's global talent. And the ones that offer the best environment for, these sovereign individuals be the ones that dominate, the next century.
I really like that. I think it's a great way for us to close. Luke Powell, thank you for your time. Before we sign off, was there anything that I should have asked or that wasn't discussed that you'd like to let the audience know?
I think that was great. I had a good time. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, thank you for your time, for coming on and speaking with us. yeah, you guys stay tuned. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, engage, and also get the word out that Luke is looking to get on any podcasts that he can, any shows, and really do his part for the community. So make sure that you're tagging him on
Gotta spread
Twitter.
the
And
word. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. Take care.